And welcome, listeners, to this hour of We the People. I'm your host, David Whettstone, right here at your Jazz and Justice radio station for more than 46 years, WPFW 89.3 FM, WPFWFM.org. We the People deals with the intersection of race, politics, history, and culture. And especially where these combine and meet, they leave us a legacy, and they're very much present with us now. So one of the topics that would fit under that rubric would be social change and soul care for turbulent times. What might it take to take care of ourselves and work collectively for justice and peace? To answer that question and to move us forward and beyond, Dr. Liza J. Rankow is with us. She's an interfaith minister, educator, activist, and writer. Her work centers the healing that is essential to personal and social transformation. She is the founder and former executive director of One Life Institute, supporting the well-being of frontline activists and caregivers working to uplift communities. Dr. Rankow has provided counseling and offered classes and workshops regarding healing and spiritual development for more than 3 decades. She is the producer and co-editor of the audio collection The Wisdom of Howard Thurman, and we'll find out more about Dr. Howard Thurman as we go through this program. Lastly, but not least, I just want you to know that Dr. Rankow received her PhD in Religion and Social Transformation from the Union Institute and University. Dr. Rankow, good morning. It's so good to have you, dear friend.
Good morning, David. It's so good to be here with you.
Oh, there's so much to cover, and this is not a topic that's often looked at least in mainstream media. So let's do some grounding. One of the ways of doing grounding would be to start with the personal. We both had the pleasure of coming to know each other through a good and just and wonderful man, Dr. Vincent Harding, a historian who worked with Dr. Martin Luther King, and dare I say, a religious leader to not only many, but one and all. Mm-hmm. Can you just briefly tell us about Dr. Vincent Harding? Because I believe it's going to be very germane to our conversation.
Dr. Harding, who passed about 9 years ago now to join the ancestors, was a preeminent historian of the freedom movement, which he adamantly did not call the civil rights movement. He said it was a lot more than just civil rights, that it was indeed a spiritual liberation movement. And he was a participant in that movement, alongside Dr. King and so many other names that are well known and unknown from that movement. He talked about Dr. King as his spiritual brother. And you mentioned my work with Dr. Thurman, which was also done in collaboration with Dr. Harding. And Thurman was Dr. Harding's spiritual father. So there is a strong lineage connection between and among them.
Many generations live because of the benefit and legacy of ancestors. For that, we're grateful. We're very, very grateful.
Ashe.
People may know of Dr. Howard Thurman from his associations of being the author of Jesus and the Disinherited and many devotional books, even though I feel his books go beyond that mere category.
Yes.
His work at Morehouse, his work in the Bay Area, from which you hail from and have worked and lived your life. And he wasn't categorically an activist, but yet was the fuel, the living engine, the wonderful provocateur that encouraged and empowered many, many people into activism. Looking at him will tell us the differences, or more positively, put us in a good focus about what soul care is, what mysticism is, and how it relates to living out our lives, not only for our own benefit, but the benefit of others. Can you further explain, put meat on that bone for me, if you please?
For sure, for sure. Howard Thurman has been called a 21st century prophet who lived in the 20th century. So just to locate him for listeners, he was born in 1899 and he passed in 1981. He was a pastor, a professor, a renowned preacher, prolific author. He was a mystic. Lerone Bennett, the writer and historian who many of your listeners may be familiar with, he called Thurman an activator of activators and a mover of movers. So Thurman was a spiritual and theological guide for Martin King and many others in the freedom movement and beyond. He was the first African American to meet with Mahatma Gandhi in 1936 and really brought that nonviolent social change philosophy and seeded it here in the States. And Dr. King picked it up, and you might even say gave it legs, and brought it as central to the freedom movement here.
You know, I mentioned Jesus and the Disinherited, pivotal work of Dr. Thurman. Dr. King would carry a copy of that wherever he went throughout his travels, throughout his work. Somewhere in a briefcase, somewhere nearby would be a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited.
That's right. It was required reading for the Nashville wing of the movement as well.
Yes, and I dare say that Morehouse and Spelman students have ample opportunity to encounter Dr. Thurman and that work.
Yes.
Mysticism. Can you explain it in a preliminary fashion? We can build upon that as we go along.
So my simple definition of mysticism is a direct relationship with the divine within all of life. Now, what do I mean by the divine, right? So some people call it God, others call it spirit or the universe or nature, but really it's that sacred essence that exists within and beyond all beings. Now, a more scholarly definition would be a direct experience of ultimate reality. But since most folks outside academia, don't generally talk in terms of ultimate reality, I find that one less helpful. Yeah.
But, in many respects, we all deal with ultimate reality in our struggle for living, in our care for others. And I've asked your permission. I want to share another aspect of your background. I don't know if it's a dichotomy. When I view you and know you, I know this is a continuation of all the work that you've your life has purpose to do. But you practice as a clinical physician's assistant in pediatric hematology and oncology. That deals with blood work and cancer of young ones at Duke Hospital in North Carolina. From there, you moved into public health research and education, particularly related to LGBTQ plus issues. And the further that work, you were one of the initial project directors of one of the first three federal pilot programs under the Women's Health Initiative that really looked at the health of lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women. Mm-hmm. So this professional task is not far afield. This engine of mysticism is not far afield in what you do and what many others do to take care of all of us.
Yeah, for me, the through line is healing. You know, in my life, that has taken many forms. It has taken the form of individual counseling. It has taken the form of medical practice and public health research. And it has taken the form of spiritual care. But because I don't see body, mind, spirit being as separate things, to me, it's all one piece.
So, to give people even more of a bridge, because I imagine, again, some of this that we're talking about is new to many listeners. Some of the topics or workshops that you've done cover mysticism and social change, sustaining the soul of activism, deepening the well, the last one being a kind of multi-faith, multi-ethical approach to spiritual formation. Mm-hmm. So that helps us out a little bit, but maybe here's a leading question that might help us further. There's a difference between self-care, which is praiseworthy, and soul care. What's the difference that you might want to have us know?
Well, soul care is the term that we developed for the Sustaining the Soul of Activism program at One Life Institute, more than a dozen years ago. And the idea was to make a distinction between activities that are primarily to relieve stress and those that support a deeper inner healing and transformation. So I can unpack that a little bit, maybe. People use the term self-care to cover a lot of territory. And some people may use it to mean what I'm talking about when I say soul care. But other people use it to mean, a glass of wine or a beer after a hard day, or a mani-pedi, or watching Netflix and having your favorite comfort food, right? Sometimes we need that kind of zone out time, but it's not transformative, right? Another issue I have with self-care is that because our United Statesian culture is so good at commodification, there's a whole self-care industry that has evolved, usually with a hefty price tag, out of reach of really the people that need it most. And it's very individualistic, right? So you may be working at your job or working in the movement and you feel burnt out, and people say, okay, you go away and take care of that, and then you can come back, right? But our pain happens in community, and our healing can also happen in community. So to me, soul care is about how we stay connected to that place within ourselves, that place of the divine, right? Where this inspires us to do the work of our calling and allows us to bring our best self to it on an ongoing basis, our wisest self, our truest self, that part of us that is informed by that larger life and wisdom that I was talking about in terms of mysticism.
The pursuit of a genuine, integral, solidly present self. We're going to come up shortly on our break, but can you give us a clue, since we've mentioned and referenced and to some degree invoked Howard Thurman. He was noted for encouraging people to pursue that. Why is this personal self not divorced from the collective, the community, and others that we live with? Why was that so important to Dr. Thurman?
Well, there's a whole conversation I think I want to loop back to, David, in talking about this intersection between mysticism and social transformation. That Thurman was writing and speaking, literally the title was Mysticism and Social Action, back in the late 30s, 1940s, all the way to the end of his life. That to him, that inner personal transformation and the outer social transformation were like the in-breath and the out-breath. They are not separate. That we can't just have one without the other any more than we could only breathe in all the time or only breathe out all the time. So to just pick up around mysticism with that, right? That the mystic worldview tells us that there's a wholeness out of which all life emerges. And social transformation is about restoring that wholeness where we have forgotten, right? We could not have the kind of social structure of domination and exploitation that we have if we had not forgotten and lost sight of the wholeness and lost sight of, to the mystic, it's one. We are all one. All is one. Thurman was adamant about that. So tapping into that oneness means that we have to work for the liberation, and Thurman said this, it was not a popular thing to say, requires that we work for the liberation of not only the oppressed, but the oppressor as well. Because without a shift in consciousness of the oppressor, we can make social reforms, but they're not going to last. You know, look no further than the rollback of voting rights, than the rollback of reproductive rights. We're sitting in the middle of the evidence of this. And it's hard work. You know, it's hard work. It's where, to me, the social action becomes a spiritual mandate. I don't even know if I answered you. I lost track of what your question was at this point.
You answered this question so thoroughly. Thank you. No doubt about it. Listeners, you're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM, WPFWFM.org. In this hour, it's the hour of We the People. I'm your host, David Whettstone. But more importantly, we're focusing on a topic that fits our summer fun and membership drive: social change and soul care for turbulent times. Dr. Liza Rankow, a dear friend, but known more to the public, particularly in the Bay Area, as an interfaith minister, educator, and activist and writer. Dr. Rankow, again, it's such a pleasure to have you talking about social change and soul care for turbulent times. We talked about how Howard Thurman was so particularly encouraging to everyone he met, whether it was a student or somebody just walking in off the street, possibly either on a campus or at the worship place of the House of Prayer for All Peoples.
The Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples.
Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. Mm-hmm. Forgive me, that's a Freudian slip. There's a congregation here in D.C. known as that. Let's repeat that again. The Church
for the Fellowship of All Peoples. It's in San Francisco. And this is a church that was co-founded by Dr. Thurman in 1944. It was the first interracial, intercultural, interfaith congregation in the United States, intentionally so, right? The Azusa movement, it kind of happened. But Fellowship Church, they had co-pastors, one black, one white. The leadership of the church was folks of all cultures,
races and ethnicities, yes.
Absolutely. And this was a time think now in 1944, not just Jim Crow is going on, but the Japanese internment was going on. So for them to all be together in one congregation was a radical act.
Radical, but yet so necessary. The force, the spirit of life is reflected in such decisions and such purpose. Is it too early to ask, through your work and appreciation of Dr. Thurman, what were some of the steps or some of the understandings and actions he would want us to have to grasp, to appreciate one purpose? In this world, there's so much cynicism and defeatism. There's so many circumstances around us that initially would give us the impression that that's indeed difficult, and yet it's not. And yet it's not.
So Thurman, just give a little bit to link it together. You said he offered, care and inspiration to, all comers, and that is absolutely true. And he also had a special relationship with folks on the front lines of the freedom movement. And even in years after, like in the 70s, and beyond until his death, well, he passed in 81, so the 70s, he would invite leaders to come out for a time of respite with him. He was in San Francisco at this point, and they would come and they would take long walks by the water to reflect and counsel. And he would set them up to listen to some of his sermons and talks. But it was a way of giving spiritual nourishment to sustain people as they went back out in the streets. And also a way of deepening their discernment about why they were out in the streets. Dr. Harding talked about, Thurman was who they would sit with both before and after major actions to help them think about it and then reflect on it. There were 3 questions that Thurman would ask people in terms of understanding their deeper purpose. And this wasn't just the movement activists, this was everybody. Who are you? And then he would pause. He was known for his long pauses. He would pause and he would say, who are you really? Really? Right? So it's a question of identity, not just what do you do for a living, but at the deepest part of yourself. Who are you? What's your truth? Then out of that understanding, and these weren't things that was like you sit down and answer them all right then. These are things to walk with, live with, reflect on over time. The second question was, what do you want? And you would say, want. So you knew it wasn't just like a superficial want. It was like, what is it that your soul must have? Sometimes instead of that one, he asked, what are you for? And I hear that 2 ways, right? What are you in favor of? And what is your purpose? What are you created to be and to do? And then understanding that, he would say, and how will you get it? So identity, purpose, and then means. Yeah. Those questions I have lived with for decades. And I come back to them again and again, and they're the kind of questions that reveal themselves in layers over time. And that becomes a compass, really, to guide us for not just your job or your vocation, right? Not just your achievement of some social measure of success. But what is the deeper purpose? And again, this becomes a mystic kind of consideration. What is the deepest purpose for which we have taken human incarnation? at this time, in this constellation of the world, right? What is our contribution toward healing, toward justice, towards transformation, to meet the demands of these times? And, I think the larger umbrella one, and each of us might have our own unique expression within that, but to me, it does come back to the restoration of wholeness, toward healing oppression and division, toward healing the wounds of trauma, so that we can bring a greater wholeness individually and collectively.
I mentioned earlier that you were the founder and former executive director of One Life Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had the pleasure of being out in San Francisco and going across to the East Bay into Oakland,
mm-hmm.
and being at a couple of the events that the One Life Institute has done many, many years ago. But importantly, can you talk about how that and other groups help in this pursuit of purpose, of meaning, of soul care, and dare I say soul force or soul love in dealing with the world at large?
Mm-hmm. I'm
really cheating here. I try to say how, give us some examples of how this legacy that Dr. Thurman has left us.
I like your evocation of soul force and soul love, which is a Gandhian in reference in terms of the social justice movements that Gandhi led, that were really based on that soul force as that which strengthens us to do the work of social justice. At One Life Institute, we like Thurman, we served everybody, but we had a special calling and a special outreach to frontline activists and community caregivers. That anybody who was, our informal mission was, we lift up the folks that lift up the folks. So whether it is somebody who that was their job description, or whether that's the grandma on the block who, when somebody's baby gets killed, they're the ones that go, the people who are the lifting up the community, we tried to get underneath them and lift them up. And part of that is, how do we process, how do we both protect ourselves from and recover from trauma and burnout, right? A lot of talk about sustainability. But genuine sustainability is not just doing some practices that patch you back together so you can go back out and keep on keeping on working in the same dysfunctional ways that that got you in that condition in the first place, right? So for me, this comes back to the soul care. That at the heart of what I mean by soul care is, how do we connect? And this, again, mysticism, right? How do we connect to that place of communion with Source, with the larger spirit, with the larger life? And for people who don't vibe with, spiritual terminology, how do you draw strength from ancestors or cultural heritage, from the community, the comrades that you are in struggle with, from nature, right? What is the thing that's larger than our individualized self that holds us, from which we can draw strength, where we feel the wholeness and the belonging and are nourished by that, right? So what are the practices that support our living into that connection? Not just as I'm burnt out, I'm going to go take this cure, and then I'm going to go back into the, right? But how do we, like the in-breath and the out-breath, how do we integrate those practices, that awareness, into our daily lives. And what those practices are going to be different for different folks, or different in different moments of our life. Because sometimes, meditation is the thing that really nourishes us. Excuse me. And sometimes that's just not available. But putting on some music that makes us, dance in the living room or makes us cry is the medicine we need. Or going to get out and sit with a tree and just breathe with your bare feet on the earth, right? There are so many different pathways. Reading poetry or scripture is what is nourishing for some people. Having a prayer partner, creative work, right? So whether it is writing or music or visual art, that creativity, for some people it's cooking, whatever is that it nourishes the creative spirit in you, because that's what connects you to something larger than yourself. I encourage people to crowdsource, ask your friends, what is it that connects you to that source of life that nourishes you? And to write it down. David, you and I are about the same vintage. So you might share the memory with me of when I was growing up in the house, there was one phone, and it was a rotary dial phone attached to the kitchen wall, right? Next to the phone, taped to the wall, was the emergency contact list. It was, the hospital, the fire department, poison control, stuff like that.
But it also had relatives and neighbors.
In case of emergency, right? Mm-hmm. The idea being that when there's an emergency, you don't have time to start looking through the phone book. So similarly, when we are exhausted and traumatized and burnt out, we may not be able to remember the practices that nourish our souls. So I say, write it down, make your spiritual 911 emergency contact list, and literally write it down and add things to it as they come to you. Add things to it as you get ideas from other people, so that when you feel like toast, you can go look at your list and find something on there that's going to jump out in that moment as available to you, right? It sounds kind of silly, but it can be a lifeline in those moments when, we really need it.
You're listening to We the People right here at WPFW 89.3 FM, WPFWFM.org. I'm your host, David Whettstone, but I always say more importantly is the guests and the topics that we have with us, whether it's on the air or how we live day to day. Today, Dr. Liza Rankow is talking to us about social change and soul care for turbulent times. Dr. Rankow, I thank you. I thank you so much how we're spending the hour, and we have a few more minutes that we can utilize. First, I want to spell out your name for listeners so people can find out about you and the work that you've been doing with others. Liza Rankow. I'm sorry, Rankow. Excuse me, Freudian slip, because I'm thinking about spelling out your name. Dr. Liza Rankow. Her name is spelled Liza, and the last name is Rankow. And you'll find her listed. You'll see maybe references to One Life Institute, references to her work. I know she's at work on many projects even now. Mm-hmm. And it just makes good sense that when we find somebody like her, we really receive and embrace the common time together. We must have the energy and stamina. We must build up a momentum to make life have some meaning, some sense, or more importantly, some sense of justice. I'd like to ask in this concluding point, Um, First, I want to go from the micro to the bigger issues or the bigger concerns you have. Often, when we get together and we're collectively together, we as a group sometimes feel just as oppressed or disorientated or intimidated as if we were just by ourselves. What can we do either as individuals, but preferably as a group, not to succumb to the initial pulse of discouragement, but get on a positive course of having what we need, having a purpose to make changes for the better? Tough question. I'm sorry.
Well, tough question to answer in the very few minutes we have remaining, David. Um, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's about how do we bring this from the individual to the collective.
And often collective groups, we get just as intimidated, especially if the whole group experiences trauma. Yeah.
For sure. And that's not a last minutes of a program answer. A part of that answer, right? Not the whole thing, but a part of that answer is engaging in these practices collectively, right? We talked about Dr. Harding and Dr. King and Dr. Thurman and their involvement in the Southern Freedom Movement. Communal spiritual practice of singing and prayer and shared worship was central to that movement. And we see it today most clearly in the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty and in the movement for Black lives. By bringing spirituality into our activism and embracing activism as a spiritual practice itself, right? As a practice of liberation, not just in social structures, but liberation of our wholeness, right? Then we are transformed as we transform the world. The process is reciprocal.
It's reciprocal and it grows.
Mm-hmm.
And it grows.
Mm-hmm.
And that can bring us much pleasure and joy. How do we move forward with you? What would you like to leave us with? I ask that outrightly because I'm mindful. We're one moment, one broadcast. But I do want to honor not only you, but many, many people in our communities that do this kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, you very kindly spelled out my name, but I want to invite people to my website because on there are recorded guided meditations. There is a monthly blog, and I hope that writing will be nourishing to people. And my website is my name, so lizarankow.org. And you can sign up for my email list and get notice when I'm doing workshops and retreats, which at this point are all on Zoom. I don't know how much time we have in terms of leading a practice right now, but the simplest and most accessible practice that each of us has in any given moment is our breath. I know when I'm stressed, I forget to breathe, or I breathe really shallow, right? So just pausing and taking a slow, full, deep breath can be a powerful reset. And we can add specific intention to the breath to make it even more powerful, right? The intention to connect with that source that we started off talking about and to infuse ourselves with the qualities that we need most in that moment. It might be peace or strength, centeredness, joy, healing, vitality, any of the qualities of the divine. I imagine breathing them in from the cosmos and pouring them in from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Just even one breath of that makes a difference, but hopefully it will feel so good you'll continue for several breaths. Do we have time, David, for me to actually guide people in a 3-breath process, or is just telling about them all that we can do before we close off?
I think it's the latter.
2.5 minutes. All right.
That's our engineer, Mike Nacella. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. So this will demonstrate that you don't need a lot of time. So I invite listeners, wherever you are, if you are in a place that you feel safe to close your eyes, I invite you to allow your eyes to close. And otherwise, just allow your gaze to soften with a downward glance. We're going to take 3 deep breaths together, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. So let's breathe. First breath, as you breathe in whatever qualities you need to support yourself in this moment. Peace, healing, freedom, love, wholeness. And as you exhale, pour those qualities into your body, mind, and being, from the crown of your head to the soles of your feet. And next, I invite you to breathe in whatever qualities you want to bless the people in your life with, the folks you carry in your heart, the folks you work with, whoever is on your radar. Breathe in whatever qualities you want to send to them. And on the exhale, breathe that out as a blessing to them. And then for this last breath, I invite you to breathe in whatever qualities you want to bless the world with. Wholeness, peace, justice, liberation. And send them out on your exhalation to enfold the world. Now take one more breath to bring your awareness back to yourself, feeling yourself fully present. As you exhale, gently allow your eyes to open. Thank you.
Well, thanking Dr. Liza Rankow once again. Coming up next is the news. Hopefully we'll meet again next week. Thank you for supporting WPFW. You can still do that as we go off the air, but hopefully you remember some of the show and it encourages you. The rivers run dry.